Sometimes the prose just gets in the way, and it's time for some horror-adjacent poetry. Welcome to the depths. Welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me today. Today I have a review of two small books of horror poetry, or horror-adjacent poetry. These are both published by Raw Dog Screaming Press. The first is Bestial Mouths by Brenda S. Tolian, and this is actually published in November of 2024. And then the second one is going to be On the Subject of Blackberries, and this is by Stephanie M. Wytovich, and this was actually published in October of 2023, but it recently won a Bram Stoker Award. These are both very short collections of horror poetry or horror-adjacent poetry, so I thought I would combine the review of them. Now I have to say, it's hard to review poetry, for me at least. When I read these, especially since they're very short collections, and when I read poetry in general, I usually will read everything once and then read it again aloud. So once to myself and once aloud, because I like to feel the rhythm of it. I like to have the sense of space that the poetry occupies. And so I did that with these. And of these two collections, I enjoyed them both, one more than the other. So let's talk about them. The first one, Bestial Mouths by Brenda S. Tolian. That cover is really evocative, isn't it? And I think a lot of the poetry is the same way. This poetry style is very stripped down. There isn't any real sense of strong narration moving from poem to poem or even within a poem. It's very much based on like strong imagery. And a lot of the lines are very, very short, sometimes only 1 or 2 words per line. And as a result, you have to build an image around these like disparate ideas. And it works well at that. This collection, it feels somehow both very earthy, like almost loomy and peaty, but ethereal at the same time. It's so earthy and loomy because it feels grounded and it feels like mulch. It feels like something rotting and transforming into something new. But because of the style that's so sparse with its language and it doesn't have any narrative flow, right? It has some, but that's not the kind of style of poetry. It feels very open-ended, and that gives it a lot of space and air as well. So somehow it manages to be both earthy and ethereal or weightless at the same time, which I think is really skillful. Also, I think the themes in here, the way they're explored, is exciting because it seems to be like an exploration of contrast. So some of the poems are taking the perspective of the victim, of someone who is experiencing abuse or trauma or harm in some way. But other poems are from the point of view of the victimizer, the one doing the harming, the one cutting the throat, the one doing damage. So there's always a tension across the collection. In the same way, some of these poems are about transformation and metamorphosis and creating something new, and other poems are about a dissolution or an ending of things, or just the dissipation into nothingness. And so again, it's this contrast of black and white, and they're all contained within this collection. So on that regard, I thought the collection was effective. I thought it was really strong imagery, and I thought the way it played the themes from multiple perspectives at once across the collection was really good, and I appreciated it in that regard. However, none of these poems really gripped me. A lot of them, I could see the emotions that they were playing with, and I think that they did use really visceral imagery to bring those emotions to the forefront. So I could see what they were talking about, what they wanted to explore, but none of it had like deep talons into my heart. You know what I mean? And that, I don't know what you expect of poetry, how moved you expect to be. For the most part, I read them and I was appreciative of them, but they didn't really hit me very deeply. I think that is at least in part because this style of very stripped down verse that really expects you to create the connective tissue between lines because it is so barren almost on the page. That, when it's done well, I think is incredibly evocative, and it really forces you to create the picture on your own and create a narrative in your own mind, connecting everything. But when it isn't done well, you get this great imagery, but the connective tissue between them is harder to find or harder to create on your part. And so I had a hard time creating the tissue that would bind all of these lines together. Do you know what I mean? So that could very well be me, because that isn't a style of poetry that is one that I gravitate toward. So that's why I say I have a hard time reviewing this, because if that is the kind of poetry that really grips you and is compelling for you, then you might very much love this collection. For me, I thought it was good. I appreciated it. I thought the imagery was strong. I thought the language use was really strong. It managed to combine these disparate sentimentalities of being earthy and weightless, or of being dark and of being light, of being the victim and victimizer. The way it managed to do that, I thought was really skillful. So if that sounds like something that you like and that kind of poetry is your jam, then I think you'll enjoy this one. And now the second book of poetry that I want to talk about is called On the Subject of Blackberries by Stephanie M. Wytovich. And this I really enjoyed. So in the foreword to this collection, and even on the jacket copy, the author or the poet explains that this poetry is born from her postpartum depression, especially, which she had a really difficult time after her child was born. And what she turned to as a major source of solace during that time was Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And so this poetry is heavily inspired by that story. And she used that as a jumping off point for these poems. So these poems aren't based on that story. They aren't telling like a fan fiction of that story, but the imagery and the ideas from We've Always Lived in the Castle seep their way into this poetry. And this poetry, it feels like an invocation, you know? It is really dark. It is unflinching. And the collection, it is separated into 10 parts, and each part has a number of poems, but none of the poems are titled. They just flow from one to another. And it feels like these nameless poems are sliding up against one another in the same way that, shadows eat each other. The poems feel like they're overlapping and they are mixing, and it feels like there is some sort of narrative. But the truth is, when you look at it, there is no narrative. It has this narrative mentality or this narrative modality, but all it is pure id, right? It is fear, and it is shame, it is anger, it is rejoicing, it is whatever you can read into and read out of the act of violence that is living in a difficult world. The use of language is really spectacular in this one. The way she described very ordinary things using adjectives and ideas that were counterintuitive to those was a really good fit. It paired really well. It created a really strong sense of atmosphere. And these poems I really felt myself being drawn into. Now, again, there isn't like a strong narrative. There is a feeling, right? There's an emotion. This emotion, it wears like the guise or the pretense of having narrative style. But what it's really doing is striking right at your experience. And it's asking you to meet it and see how you weigh up against the poison dripping from its veins. It is really, really compelling in that way. Obviously, I haven't had any of the life experiences that this poet has, the experiences that birthed this collection, and yet still this collection was able to elicit these emotional experiences from me, and a few of the poems were really able to halt me in my tracks and send a shiver down my spine. And that's because I think they were speaking to emotional experiences that are common to humanity when facing difficulty. And even though they were centered in her specific experience or born from her specific experience, because of that, they actually became accessible to a much wider group of people, myself included. These poems are intimate, they are dark and cutting, and they are disturbing. They are never aiming for shock or disgust, but they're aiming for recognition. They're aiming to bring you closer to this experience, because the only way to exercise this experience is to face it, to recognize it. And that's what these poems invite you to do, is to recognize these experiences in your own life through this stream of consciousness declaration of what it means to live in a difficult world, one filled with thorns and poison. So that is my take on those two collections of poetry. I think they're both fun. I think they are different styles of poetry. I've read a lot of horror poetry, often in anthologies. You'll have one or two poems thrown in for good measure, and very rarely am I moved by horror or horror adjacent poetry. I don't know why. I love horror. I enjoy good poetry. I have a hard time when the two of them intersect to find them very moving. In both of these collections, there were pieces that moved me. Obviously, the second one on the subject of blackberries was gripped me a little stronger because that style of poetry spoke to me more. But I thought they were both really well done. And if you like this kind of sparse, very emotion-driven poetry, then I think you can find something to enjoy in both of these. What do you think about horror poetry? Do you think that that is a good place for emotional exploration, or do you think maybe poetry and horror don't really have any place to cross paths? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. But for now, thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.